Okay, welcome to the first panel. My name is Wale Adebanwi. So this panel is Encountering the State and Society, Vulnerability, Precarity, Solidarity, and Alternative Lives. So we have three presenters, two are here with us, and the third presenter is online. The first presenter is Anderson Eric Gonçalves dos Santos. He's from the University of California, Santa Barbara. The first part of his, the title of his talk, as I told him, given how good my Spanish is, I will not read the second part. He tried to teach me how to pronounce it well, but I don't want to betray how good my Spanish is. So the title of the talk is The Plight for Land and Environment in the Polar Council of Guape Basin and Valley. The second presenter is Ronaldo Torres Arena, and he's from University College London in the United Kingdom. The title of his talk is Living Through Crisis, Everyday Lives of Instability in Peru and the Global South. And the last presenter is Jaira Harrington from the University of Illinois, Chicago. The title of the paper is Slow Erosion, Afro-Brazilian Trust in an Evolving Democracy. So we'll start with the first presenter, Anderson.
Morning, everyone. My name is Anderson. Thank you, Dr. Adebanwi, for the introduction. This is part of my research at the University of California, Santa Barbara, my MA research. Eventually, it will be further expanded during my PhD. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Quilombola Council, the Maroon Council of the Guape Basin and Valley that represents 18 communities in the region where I come from, Bahia. Never mind, I'm going to continue without the slides. The Recôncavo region is located, the Iguape Basin and Valley is located in the Recôncavo region in Bahia, which is well known as a place where sugarcane and tobacco crops were produced for exportation. Hence, it's a place that relied heavily on enslaved work. In the aftermath of slavery, Maroon people were not granted access to land, but many people remained in those very sites near former sugar mills to guarantee land access. Throughout the 20th century and the early 21st century, communities in the area have been experiencing several processes of land dispossession and environmental pollution. By the late 90s, the communities, which are 18, but there are more, of course. 18 are part of the council, but there are more. 18 communities gathered and formed a council. The purpose of the council initially was to fight against land dispossession, notably so-called landowners that claim to possess the land that Maroon communities occupy. The political process to raise awareness to give the council started off within a Afro dance company. The purpose back then was to gather youth to discuss the problems going on in the late 90s, hyperinflation, land dispossession, impoverishment, closure of a palm oil processing plant that entailed a large wave of unemployment and migration. So the purpose of those that spearheaded the process was to gather youth, discuss the problems, and later on, the youth that took part in this dance company became leaders of the associations that were created in each Maroon community to discuss the problems going on and discuss how to address them. So the process started off in the late 90s, and then in 2005, the council was formally created in 2005. In this year, it completes 20 years of existence. And what it started off as an endeavor to fight land dispossession is nowadays also fighting different problems, amongst them environmental issues. Since the majority of the people living in the area rely on agriculture or fishing to make a living. For them, freedom means having access to land firstly, and also to a land that's not polluted, because they rely on shell fishing and fishing mainly to make a living. However, some major structural projects have affected their livelihoods. First, the dam that was built in 1985 to counter the floods that often affected the region. For quilombolas I interviewed 15 council members. For them, the construction of the dam is not the major problem because it prevented floodings from occurring. The major problem for them is the fact that the hydro plant that was implemented in 2002 functions in a way that disrupts biodiversity in the basin. In what way? They hold water within the reservoir all day long, and they release a huge amount of water in the evening, and that has led to disappearance of species in the mangroves, disappearance of species in the mangrove, and also it takes them much longer to gather the amount of shellfish or the amount of fish they use it to fish before the hydro plant. Also, against the will of fishers and shellfishers, a shipyard was implemented in the region 10 years ago, 11 years ago. This shipyard, in order to it to be constructed, the destructive marine reserve that protects the so the word in English skipped out of my mind. Maybe the Brazilians in the room can help me. A mata que circula o manguezal. No, never mind. There is a extractive reserve, and it should be kept because this is where quilombolas extract palm oil, and the maintenance of this marine reserve is also important to the mangroves. But since the existence of extractive reserve hindered the construction of a shipyard, because a shipyard brings in a lot of environmental impacts, the government changed the regulations regarding the protection of the extractive reserve so that it could have the shipyard constructed. Of course, the shipyard brought a lot of problems to the region, which I'm not going to further explore today. I'm just going to focus mostly on the hydro plant and what it brought to the communities in case. This is a collaborative map built by the communities. I worked initially with 2 of them, and then I further expanded to 5 communities. Because of time constraints, I am allowed to work with people in all the 18 communities. This research was approved both by the council and then afterwards by the IRB at UCSB. I worked with communities located in this region of the map. I'll give you a brief overview on the situation of Maroon communities currently in Brazil, and then I'll move on to the problems specific to that location. Since 2016, the processes of land titling, which is a major demand of Maroon people in Brazil, got stuck because of the extreme right backlash. And that entailed not only a rhetoric of violence, but also lots of lethal violence affecting Maroon leaders. According to the National Coordination of Quilombo Communities in Brazil, land-related deaths have surged. This is the main cause of Maroon activists' death. And secondly, femicides, but also the femicides are linked to land-related conflicts because in the case of the communities that I worked with, and also in Brazil overall, women spearhead those movements. So land titling got stuck because of extreme right rhetoric and actions. There are many cases of people, not only in my state, but in other states that have been killed. So in light of this context of violence, I decided to work with those communities and investigate in what ways land, labor, and environment affect their social reproduction. This is a preliminary study, as I mentioned. It was facilitated by the council, meaning that I interviewed people appointed by the council, and after each interview, they would also appoint me to somebody else. And then I interviewed 16 active members or former active members. As a reciprocity of the project, we organized education activities for kids and teenagers in 2 Quilombola schools. Normally, council members are also teachers in the school, so they validated the sort of activity that we should conduct. And last Sunday, I went to their monthly meeting. They hold monthly meetings to decide on everything that they want to pursue. So in the last Sunday, I was in Brazil and I went to their meeting to present the findings, and we discussed how the research is going to evolve from now on. As I mentioned, historically, they have problems in regarding having access to land to cultivate plots. Even though their elders have occupied their land for years and years, before the creation of the council, they were often facing issues like farmers releasing animals to destroy crops, people being forced to pay a monthly fee to cultivate crops, threats, public whippings, and so forth. So this is a problem that is found in the literature and in the interviews across the 20th century, and more recently, as I mentioned earlier, health problems affecting fishers and shellfish collectors because there is a substance within the mud of the mangroves, which upon contact with the skin causes an unbearable itching. All the interviewees whom I interviewed that go regularly to the mangroves have problems in their skins. It's visible. I refused to take pictures of it. They eventually asked me to touch because the surface of their skins have changed because of this issue, and it's not been addressed thus far by public health authorities. Along with the reduction of shellfish and fish species, the biodiversity in the region has changed because of the industries that are located there. Some of those industries don't have environmental permits to function, whereas quilombolas that cultivate oyster in the mangroves have to have a license. So the government deals differently with quilombolas and with industries and so-called landowners. Now I move to some findings of the research. People whom I interviewed see the Quilombola Council as a popular university where they foster intergenerational education regarding the history of the area and how the plight should be conducted. So both elders and youth attended meetings, children as well. They claim that after the creation of the council, they learned collectively to stand up for themselves, whereas in the past, they recall harsh memories of robbery of dignity, often being subjected to violence by neighboring so-called landowners and also state officials that hinder land titling and hinder Quilombolas' access to basic social rights and political rights. They rely on place-based collective forms of solidarity to claim their land and to continue to fight together. For example, even if land titling is granted by the government, there is a problem that they foresee. For example, people within the communities that disagree with the collective mode of organizing of the council, meaning that they want, even though they're part of the council, they want to have their own plots of land. They want to decide the amount of land they will have, and the council within its meetings push these people to abide to the collective mode of organizing. They also work hard to protect the extractive marine reserve because they understand that if they don't keep it, it poses a threat to the mangroves. Within the council, whenever there is an elder, there has to be a youth. Whenever there is a male, there has to be a female. So, and also they refuse individualist solutions. They try to, for example, in the last meeting, they were discussing that some people, out of fear or desperation, succumb to pressures of so-called landowners to buy plots of land. Even when a plot of land is recognized by the government as a quilombola land, it cannot be sold. However, landowners come to small farmers and tell them, I am going to sell this land because it's been titled as quilombola. I don't want to lose my money. So if you want to keep the land that you've been living for years and years with your family, you have to pay a certain amount of money. So the council is nowadays, thank you. The council is nowadays struggling with people that succumb to those pressures. As I mentioned earlier, most of the activities conducted within the council are led by women. There is also, of course, the participation of men, but male figures in the region argue that the council is about women politics. It's not about women politics only. They claim that it's about women politics because they see that women spearhead most of the activism. It's not that it's only about women politics, but that women stand up for those communities collectively, not only for their lives as individuals. And then I'm out of time, I know, so I'll conclude here. 5, okay. But also, I think I have finished my presentation. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take questions at the end of all the presentations. The second presenter, Leonardo. So Leonardo is speaking to the topic titled Living Through Crisis, Everyday Lives of Instability in Peru and Global South.
There's a presentation. Cannot see the presentation here. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Well, hi everyone. Well, I'm going to present the Living Through Crisis, Everyday Life Instability in Peru, both in general and the Global South, but focusing in Peru. Yeah, next slide, please. Yes. So instability. There is a concept that is not only for the Global South, it's present in every part of the world, Global North too, but it's very important because the Global South is not an exception, but it's part of the everyday life. People, communities in general in these countries. The concept also is very important to know, the concept of polycrisis, which helps, by the way, to understand how we can overlap, well, not we, but the context can overlap different crises like economic, political, and social breakdowns. We're going to see here one very interesting scenario in Peru, where you have like all of them together and how they interact between each other. And Peru is a powerful case study because of that. We have a chronicle political turmoil, and yes, economic inequality. Our research question here is, how do Peruvians navigate these overlapping crises in their daily lives? Next slide, please. Yes, so about the conceptual framework, I have included 3 different frameworks, like Butler's and Adebanwi. There is their statement that crisis reveals limits of state sovereignty and the politics of who gets to live. It's very important because, for example, for instance, in one of my interviews with this pharmaceutical CEO of Peru, he explained me that he was not afraid, but we're going to talk about extortions and how criminality has increased in Peru. He was telling me that he was not afraid at all happening something to his company or his family, because he was like friends with the police. So it's very important who gets to life, it's always related by their incomes, by their social class, by their race. And this is something that we're going to see in this example. And clearly you can relate that not only in Peru, but to the other parts of the world. And other framework, very important, is the vernacular resilience of Quantic, which explains how communities craft their own survival mechanisms because that the government doesn't properly provide them a solution for their insecurity, political, economical security, and also, yes. Also, we're going to talk about, well, their framework is the alternative rationalities that explains how there are some ways of valuing and organizing beyond capitalist state logics. Next slide, please. Yes. So before explaining the crisis right now in Peru, I'm not going to talk here because of time about the historical background, but just to give you some very important, relevant data. Peru was the last former Spanish colony in South America to get independence. That was not a coincidence. It's because part of the oligarchy present in Peru at that time, they didn't want the independence, and they had to wait for others, North and South liberators like Venezuela and Argentina, liberators, because they didn't want properly the independence. That's something that is also still related to the political class in Peru, and it's related to the oligarchy. We were one of the latest countries in Latin America to approve voting for everyone, universal voting rights. It was in 1979. It's not a coincidence. It's part of how conservative people manage the country since the beginning of times. About political instability, we had 6 presidents in 6 years, a lot of protests, 49, we're going to talk about in the next slide, but 49 people at least get killed. We had, for the first time in 2001 years of republic, we have the first female president. That was something good, not exactly because she killed 49 Peruvians during protests, asking for new elections. So we have political instability. We also have economic inequality. This is something very present, not only in recent times, but from the beginning. And organized crimes is something that you can see in the news every day. Extortion, these local mafias are killing people, sometimes 8, 9 per day in just a capital city. And the police enforcement is not properly being able to capture them because sometimes they are part of the mafia, they are colluded with them. If a person usually, sometimes it's a person calls the police and says, oh, I've been extortion, I'm being asked to pay this amount of money. Sometimes the police filtrates those data to the criminals, and these people get killed. This is something that's very documented. And we also have the COVID-19 impact, which kind of exposed the healthcare collapse and has widened the social gaps. And yes, next slide, please. About political instability, I have written a specific article talking about this. If you want to have the details, you can see the quote over there. But in general terms, we had that from 2021, the people elected the first farmer president of the history of Peru. This was very historical. Unfortunately, he did commit crimes. I mean, he was colluded with some mafias and he stole some money. It's still in a documented scenario during judicial cases, but he's in jail right now. And because of that, the Congress didn't allow him to properly manage the country, and he made a coup and he closed the Congress. But in less than 2 hours, he was arrested, and his vice president, Dina Boluarte, assumed the power of the presidency. Because of this, how this happened, we went to the streets, mostly a lot of Peruvians went to the streets and asked for new elections, because, I mean, in Peru, we elect not only the president, we elect, as here in the US, but a president and 2 vice presidents. In this scenario, she was the only vice president of that list. And still, we asked for new elections. She didn't accept that, and the police enforcement and the military enforcement went to the streets, mostly in Andean cities. Indigenous people were shot and 49 were killed. There is a case right now in the International Criminal Court. And this is very important to understand the political context, because she is now working with some of the Congress to don't lose the power. And because of that, and you will see that in the article, she is mostly trying to not lose the control of the presidency, rather than focusing on the insecurity problems, and even the investment. The investment of the government is going through that, to see who is opposing her government, instead of looking for solutions to the insecurity. Next slide, please. Yes, grassroots strategies and local governance. So we have some informal leaders and neighborhood councils who are replacing state roles. That's, for example, about security. We have local communities, mostly in cities, because this is security, these mafias are asking for money to small entrepreneurs. So they are working together to have some groups to kind of arrest these people. This is not properly working, but they are trying their best, and this is very important to also see this as how leaderships, these informal leaderships, not part of any government, not local governments, are trying to fight, to struggle against this scenario, and they are replacing indeed state roles. We also have citizen organized protests. The most specific protests were at the beginning of the Dina Boluarte presidency in December 2022 and January 2023, where these killings happened. But there is still some protests. Unfortunately, lots of people have lost the faith in this type of protest because of the killings, and because they don't see any change, political change. Right now, the government, this president, has only 3% of approval rate in the country. It's one of the lowest in the world. And they also, these citizen organized, they're also trying to use mutual aid systems. Like, for example, we will see some vasos de leche, which is like places where you can obtain a free meal, free breakfast for kids, and have also comedores populares, which is also a way to, if you don't have enough resources to provide food for meals for your family, well, you can pull together people from your own neighborhood, so that you can economize and reduce the resource that you need for properly preparing a meal. So common practice since before, like since the 80s. But in this scenario, it's started again. It's very important how to manage one of these crises. And yes, we also having some specific pueblos jóvenes. We can translate that as local peripheric neighborhoods, which are kind of part of consequence of the migration since the 50s, people from the Andes, which were not original citizens in Lima. Yes, next slide, please. Yes, so about the vernacular resilience in action, as I was kind of explaining before, we have solidarity groups. For example, during the COVID, there were community kitchens, and those are still very important. But we are going to see, can you go one slide, please? No, sorry, like the next one? Yes, just for example, then we will return. But there is one of these vaso de leche, and there is this new in Spanish. I didn't got that one in English, but it says that there is there's a tomb, like, yes, waiting for us, because extortions are asking for 20,000 soles. This is for the workers of this local place where they produce food for the community. So extortions are not only going against small entrepreneurs, but also against communities. And this is, we don't have a solution for that. And the government is not providing a proper solution. I have interviewed some of them, and they are very afraid of what they can do, but they still, and they are still doing this, because that's the only way that communities can obtain like proper meals. Can you go back one slide, please? Thank you. Okay. So we also have economic adaptations. We have these rotating saving groups. Like once a month, you have like the number can vary, but you can have like, let's say 10 or 15 people in these groups, and each month they put, let's say $1,000, and the one specific person obtains this total, so that he or she can use that for investing in their own business. And this is a way that has been working with Peruvians since the 80s, but it's still growing once again, because right now the bank loans are very, their rates has increased a lot, and they are not having proper ways to receive funding to invest in their businesses. We also have bartering networks. And coping with climate threats, yes, there is urban agriculture, collective building strategies. The insecurity crisis is mostly, to be fair, is mostly in the coastal cities, but there is also, of course, not one, I have not spoken about that, because like kind of the always there crisis about food security, mostly in the Andean region. Can you go next 2 slides, please? Thank you. Theoretical and political implications. Well, first we need to recognize the crisis governance beyond state-centric frameworks. It's very important to properly see what's happening, like seeing the full picture here. And we also need to learn from the everyday practice of care, cooperation, and resistance. This is something that, coming myself from the Global South, is very important, because it's present in every day. It's not like a final solution. It won't erase it won't solve the problem, but it addresses the daily needs of the communities. And this is how people work. Sometimes they invest their own money and time without expecting any return, so that just their communities, and of course their families, can obtain some meals, for example. And last, Global South is a side of innovation, not just victimhood. We need to change that type of ideas sometimes present. Global South is a side of innovation. These crises provide opportunities to innovate ideas how to solve these problems. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we have instability fractures lives, but also gives rise to creativity and solidarity. It's not only present in Peru. You can see that. You can see similar examples. Like, for example, the repression I was stating before, so it's also present in Argentina right now against the elder people who are asking for their rights. So this is very, very important, how to relate with in general with the Global South, but in specific Latin America, there is a big rise of the far right movement. Some of them, they have captured the power. In Peru, I will, according to the interviews, my research and myself, I will say will have a far right government over there, which is not that obvious, but is having this hard repression against the communities. Next, we also study in Peru helps to rise broader patterns across the Global South, as I was explaining. And since this is a specific case with a lot of crises happening at the same time, and it's also important to conclude that there is a need to center local knowledge in both academic and policy responses. Yes. Next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. So we'll have the final presentation now by Yara Harrington from University of Illinois in Chicago. The title of the paper is Slow Erosion, Afro-Brazilian Trust and Evolving Democracy. Yes, Yara.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Buenos dias, bon dia. Good morning. I would like to thank the committee and planners for this conference in accepting virtual presentations. Although some of us cannot be physically present, I appreciate that this conference is accessible remotely and offers some protection to our most vulnerable colleagues, especially during these tense and unstable times politically, economically, and intellectually. So thank you. My name is Dr. Jaira Harrington, Assistant Professor of Black Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And the title of my presentation today is Slow Erosion, Afro-Brazilian Trust in an Evolving Democracy. So here's just a quick overview of this presentation. So I will first provide a background, share my research question, provide a conceptual framework for the research project, describe my methodology and offer some preliminary findings, and last, discuss future directions for the project. So I will begin with some research background about myself. I've conducted research in Brazil, mainly on the extra systemic and activist politics of Black communities. In political science, the field in which I have been trained, democracy is the assumed standard for a politically healthy country. Democracy is generally understood as people rule through direct or indirect patterns of political behaviors, including voting, lobbying, political organizing, and the like. Although Brazil has had other waves of government order, this definition would include the contemporary representative democracy in country. And one of the last times that I was in Brazil, it was in an incredibly tumultuous political time. It was 2018, and there were news reports that democracy was under threat once again in Brazil. This was the year in which not only the politically progressive Marielle Franco, a Black queer Rio de Janeiro city councilwoman, was assassinated. It was also the year when Jair Bolsonaro, the populist leader, was elected new president of Brazil. Bolsonaro's approach to leadership normalized public attacks on racial equity programs for Black and Indigenous groups, economic social supports for the Brazilian poor, sought to strain women, gender, and LGBTQ relations, limit environmental regulations of the Amazon, and restrict immigration policy, to name a few. And as I'm reading this aloud, this sounds all the more pressing for today. Systemically, his viewpoint promoted increased policing and military intervention, unfettered business and corporate expansion, and at times advocated for loose gun control laws for individual Brazilians. He was a proponent of iron-fisted authoritarian military rule that dominated Brazil, from 1964 through the 1980s. And a few years later, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic ravaged Brazil, leaving nearly 700,000 people dead from the virus underneath Bolsonaro's leadership. This global pandemic placed increased stress on Black, Indigenous, and poor communities that were already disproportionately impacted by unjust and racist policies on housing, health, education, economy, and others. Attention to these disparities were brought to public attention via Reaja Seja Morto, a racial justice organization in Brazil, with calls to action reflecting the global movement for Black lives. From my previous studies on marginal Black communities in Brazil, most specifically domestic workers and their unions, the fragility of Black communities' experiences under democracy have always been turbulent. From the late 20th century's promises of a restored democratic republic with the ratification of the 1988 Constitution to the 2022 re-election of Lula da Silva, democracy has been the subject of public debate for many years. It is a concept that presumably holds meaning, but when Black Brazilians continue to struggle under the weight of this political system, then what does that say about its effectiveness? What are the present-day threats to democracy in Brazil? How resilient is this political system and culture? What is the future of democracy in Brazil? So with those questions in mind, I looked to the Black communities in the sites of São Luís Maranhão and Salvador Bahia, Brazil, for possible answers. With this lived experience in Brazil, I developed connections and relationships and kinships with fellow Black and Brown people. The preoccupations around the state of affairs of the world were tempered by an awareness that Black communities have had to continuously struggle for the right to an equitable and just future. Black communities navigating a democratic Brazil still had to historically navigate a racial democracy that denied their unique lived experience under racial oppression. This present study is based on my observations and reflections on Black communities in Brazil and their experiences with democracy. So the research question I have before you: in the face of ongoing instability, what are Black Brazilians' understanding of in relationship to democracy in this post-Bolsonaro era? So Brazil's contemporary history with democracy has evolved quite remarkably in the past decade, as I've noted a bit earlier. There are three broad categories of literature on Brazilian democracy with which I engage. and they include the following. So Brazil post-authoritarian politics literature. What this literature does deeply engage with is democracy as it relates to post-authoritarian rule. And so talking about Brazil in this context is significant. But it doesn't entreat discussions of race and Black communities in a deep sort of way. It tends to emphasize regime change as the focal point. And race and democratic politics in Brazil literatures directly discusses the interrelationships among race and democracy. And there's still a limited critique of democracy as a concept, and it doesn't quite interrogate the instabilities. It still is considered a standard, if not the standard, for political organization when it comes to government structure. And Black politics in Brazil literature, these scholars have expanded the concept of democracy and allow for challenges and critiques of racial democracy in a way that interrogates the structures and critiques and challenges them. So whereas prior scholarship has had critiques of democracy, has thought about regime change, et cetera, and democracy still has a hollowed place as a political order for the standard, my theoretical intervention is that Black people, particularly those most marginalized by gender identity, class status, economic status, geography, are well suited to define and redefine democratic inclusion for themselves and through the lens of their lived experience. I hypothesize that the Black people whose voices are centered in my sample have critical views to inform and challenge notions of democracy. So I have a trained research team that is helping me collect an ongoing collection of data from 2 metropolitan regions, São Luís Maranhão State and Salvador Bahia. There will be at least 50 participants, and the respondents represent a variety of Black people from different age groups, education levels, income levels, genders, et cetera. Each interview is based on a standard semi-structured questionnaire, and the interviews last about 60 to 75 minutes each. The field research sites are unique in that they are both situated in the northeast of Brazil. Although Salvador is often cited by researchers from various disciplines, São Luís Maranhão is rarely highlighted in the literature on politics. So I'd like to mention that Brazil is a continental country. Given its size, given its the diversity geographically and regionally. So with this nation state of its size, it's important to offer specific information about the northeast of Brazil. And this region holds nearly 30% of Brazil's population. In addition to that, the historical context is significant. It bears historical significance for Black and Indigenous populations as well. So in 1500, Portuguese colonization of Brazil, then called Pindorama by the Tupi-Guarani people, began in Pernambuco, which is still a major city in Brazil. And here is an artist's rendering of this point of contact, which despite the semi-placid tone of this painting, there were continuous cycles of colonial violence and indigenous resistance. And in 1501, Salvador was named the first capital of Brazil. This city served as the initial point of contact for millions of enslaved Africans from West and Central Africa after suffering genocide, land dispossession, and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. We see a painting of enslaved Africans studying capoeira, a form of Afro-Brazilian combat and martial arts. This practice also is a cultural element of the present. Despite its vast significance to Brazil, the Northeast has historically been invisible. Its population has often been stereotyped as backward, unintelligent, and lazy. And we see this in literature, even in my time living in Brazil, in other parts of the country, these kind of stereotypes still remain. And this is due to several factors, but chief among them is anti-Blackness. Its population is mostly Black and brown, according to the National Household Survey, IBEGE. These divisions and conceptions of Northeastern identity as inferior also play out in the contemporary political landscape. So since Bolsonaro's election in 2018, I'd like to look at this graph and to kind of unpack it with you. The idea of a divided Brazil has been reinforced, marginalizing and stigmatizing the region even further. So as you can see here, Jair Bolsonaro, who is the president who was elected in 2018, we see the pretty almost even split of how it is that Brazilians voted. And the Northeast is a sea of red. So we're looking at the Workers' Party, PT, with Haddad, who is the political candidate at that time, more leftist, and Jair Bolsonaro with PSL is the right-wing candidate. So we see how it is that this divide is quite stark, where you see a sea of red in mostly the north and particularly the Northeast region there, and Jair Bolsonaro supported in the central and southern parts of the country. And the discourse about Northeasterners as starving and poor, and therefore out of desperation, were voting left-wing, voting for left-wing candidates has been strengthened over time. And another interesting factor, if you're looking at the numbers here, is the number of abstentions. So in these figures for the graph for 2022, more than 32 million people abstained. And if we include the null and blank votes, this number exceeds 35 million. So there are some habits of participatory politics that reflect a sense of alienation and low political participation, even while voting is compulsory in Brazil between the ages of 18 and 70. So political life and participatory activity are also factors worthy of discussion that I plan to explore down the line, but I just wanted to note that in this presentation. So now let's get to the sites at a glance. Comparing these cities, Salvador and São Luís, based on some demographics, the average, let's look at the metro population size. So with Salvador, nearly 4 million, São Luís, about 1.2 million. The average earnings are very low. So the average monthly earnings we see are about $90 US in Bahia or in Salvador, and in São Luís, about $70. Just for comparison, the Federal District of Brasilia monthly earnings are about 1,377 reais, which would be the highest in Brazil. And Maranhão is considered to be the poorest state in Brazil, with 53% of the population living below the poverty line, compared to 25% in the country's total. And we also see the percent of Black residents in the city. Both in Salvador and São Luís, the percentage is high. This is just to give us a bit of context. So some of the preliminary findings. We have Cielist Felix, who was interviewed. He is a community organizer and leader, and citing the Bolsonaro government and its disastrous actions in the face of the pandemic, he claims that the population is denouncing and reporting their satisfaction, even if they complain to their neighbor or make posts on social media networks. And there are more policy conversations and debates. However, sometimes based on demands from the population, politicians disguise reality without making effective changes. And in our conversation, he revealed a fascinating term for this phenomenon, a democracy of appearances. So the kind of ways in which there is a performance of democracy, there's a performance of interest, of support for democratic action, only in appearance. And so that was a fascinating take from his interview. And Celso Gaspar, who is a member of the Quilombo Boa Vista and Rosario Association, is also president in his second term. And this links up to Anderson's comments earlier on quilombolas and their treatment with public policy as it relates to environmental issues and impact. And his perspective in defining democracy, he says the following: a democracy, to be correct, needs people who have access to policies. I complain that here in the community, we don't have access to much. Today we live here, we still work in the fields, we still work without equipment that can help us to have a good production. Because of this, today, agribusiness has machines due to a policy that small producers do not have access to: a tractor, a plow, quality cement, That's why I see that democracy obscure in these things that don't arrive here in the community. We quilombolas are mistreated today, that over the years, things are changing here, that we are managing to have access to a better road. The lighting here in the community is very precarious. No, quilombola are those people who cannot have access to what a white person has. There's a lot of that here, a lot of that thought. So as we see, these early responses are in response to what have been alienation from policy that is related to the kind of historical trajectory of the region in the Northeast. And so when we think about democracy and what the kind of redresses that these communities are demanding and asking for, we see the kind of possibilities of comparative analysis within the region, and an open discussion about the relationship of political parties to Black communities and what it is that they need and desire for themselves, and the kind of autonomy that they need for those decisions to be made. So these early responses led me to think more deeply about the instability of democracy and Black communities' relationship to it. Both Silas and Celso reference point of access. So with more responses, I hope to draw increased inferences. And so some of the final directions or future thoughts that I have in future directions that I have include thinking about the resilience of democracy and how it's been challenged in the post-Bolsonaro era, and is a Lula regime shifting democracy's impact on Black communities. I think that it's also important to consider the role of party politics. And I also noticed in some of the early interviews that I have, there is a stark difference in generational approaches to thinking about democracy and participation. So I'd like to explore the political perceptions of young voters, for whom there was a mention of social media and social media networks, and what these kinds of discourses and conversations are, what kind of impact those discourses and conversations are having on their perceptions of democracy. So the working title here, we're working with slow erosion, in that trust in democracy seems to be fading with each generation for Black resilience. However, where the state falls short, the sources for survival lie in the Black communities that support one another. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we've had very interesting perspectives from Brazil, from Peru, about different forms of vulnerability, different ways in which people respond, whether as individuals or as members of communities, and the kinds of encounters, that these communities or individuals have with the state or not, and the vulnerability that result from these different forms of solidarity, the alternative life that people try to create from things different encounters. So maybe I should start with presenters, and then go to the audience. So for Alison, I really have talked about the forms of the collective forms of solidarity that is evident in your presentation, in your case study. So, but I was wondering whether these people have any form of support from outside of the community, from organizations that are usually devoted to supporting communities that are disadvantaged, and try to provide them with different kinds of resources to be able to amplify their voices and, bring their challenges to the attention of those who can also help them in doing things. I recognize, of course, that inherent in what they're doing and in your presentation is their own capacity to do something about their own conditions, which I think is the primary thing. But I'm wondering whether there are any kinds of support or networks that they create to be able to strengthen their capacity to be able to respond to the challenges that they face. I was also struck by the idea of women politics. I hope I fully understand what you were trying to represent. Is this a way by which they attempt to diminish the value of what these women are doing by talking about women politics. I'm wondering whether it's something that others, a tag that others are giving to it, or is it the way in which they're describing it themselves? Because sometimes, this whole idea of women organizing can be a way in which people are trying to devalue what these women are actually doing. So I'm interested in that. Then, Leonardo, the idea of vernacular resilience in action, I think is really captured some of the ideas that I expressed in Abdulmalik's, keynote. So I like the idea of people having their own, grammar and practices of coping, and the ways in which this raises question about whether those, practices and grammars are, geared towards transformation or just coping. Are they methods of just living through those challenges, or are they also thinking about the ways in which these, mechanisms can also help in transforming their conditions? So I'm interested in whether you have, some insight into their perspective of what this is, what this would lead to. And finally, for Jaira, yes, I think the idea of a democracy of appearances is so very, very illuminating, and I'm wondering what constitute those appearances. I mean, in their understanding of the appearances, and in a sense, it seems to me that in the different perspectives that you presented, democracy seems to be something that alienates this community. So if democracy is a form of alienation, what then is the alternative? Because democracy is supposed to be the institutional processes by which we're able to address our collective interest or an individual interest in the neoliberal sense. But I'm wondering if democracy then becomes something that seems to alienate, especially because it seems that every experience with new regime seems to be worse than what they've experienced. It doesn't really help. So and I think this is so very critical in terms of what we're trying to understand in the context of everyday forms of instability, where people's encounter with democratic norms or democratic processes becomes quite not particularly enabling, and therefore, of course, leads to the erosion of democratic processes, as perhaps we find, I think we find greater evidence where we are for this now than even elsewhere in the world. So I'll stop there, and then maybe the three of you can respond, and then we can go to the audience. Yes, please.
So regarding the collaboration with other institutions, they do accept collaboration with institutions from outside. It always has to be approved by the council. For example, researchers, universities, NGOs come and present the sort of collaboration they're looking for, and then the council members vote. All the council members vote whether they're going to accept that partnership or not. For example, this has to do with the way I conducted my research. Instead of paying people, like many people from the global north do when they go to Brazil and other countries to do research, the proposal was to do collective activities for youth and kids. So they have this mode of organizing. Also, they have a national coordination, CONAC, that advocates for Maroon communities on a national level. The reports I mentioned about lethal violence were elaborated by this national coordination. It is also the entity responsible for standing up for communities in Brasilia. This is the entity that does advocacy for Maroon communities in Brasilia, CONAC. So answering your question, they do accept, but it always has to be approved by the council. Okay. Women politics. It's to question the protagonism that women have in the council. So I wouldn't say it is to diminish, but it's to question. It's a patriarchal conflict, tension within the council, because women take part in most of the activities, lead most of the movements. For example, the charter of the council was elaborated by a working group of women. So these are tensions arising from the fact that women have a protagonism in the plight.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, So as you also said, in the Peruvian scenario, mostly in the Lima capital city, Peru scenario, yes, a lot of women, they are the ones leading the local groups in the Barrio Urbano Marginales, which are this type of local neighborhoods, mostly in the periphery of the city. And they are the ones actually leading this vernacular resilience. We have this scenario, this case of the vaso de leche. I was saying that before, this breakfast, like meals. The first of this one was established in 1984. So they have been ordered for a while, but mostly they receive local government funding. But that's also political, because sometimes if you are not agreeing with the local government, you won't get that funding. That is when you get local crowdfunding, mostly for the small local entrepreneurs, and also you can receive some donations from sometimes with companies, but that's very, very difficult to see that in more cases. And in the context of the COVID, I mean, during the pandemic and after that, several vasos de leche were closed because those areas, I mean, that early 2000s, 2010s, were closed because those areas, they kind of, let's call it, they eliminate poverty in these neighborhoods because of the pandemic. They needed this again. Right now, our way to measure the poverty according to the government has changed like several times. So right now, probably the data that you have over there is not the same metrics that you were using before. So I wouldn't take that data like a proper real one. But yes, the vasos de leches and also the ollas comunes are ways that have been there since the 80s, and they will still be there for the next decades. And that's a way that how local communities organize themselves. This self-organization allows them to provide meals, and also it's related to other, I mean, to their services that the local governments cannot afford or cannot plan at all. Like, for example, having libraries, local small libraries where they're providing a place to be with the kids while the parents are not are working. And these type of services are not only provided by women, mostly by women, and yes, usually elder women, but we have young women, like teenagers, like 18, 19 teenagers, working without the payment in this type of self-organized services. Thank you.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, so democracy of appearances, what does it look like? Mainly performative, superficial actions where the goal is not transformation, but it's more successful electoral campaigns. And this kind of behavior, again, as you point out, it creates a sense of alienation from politics where the participation in at least institutional politics is not often the direction that that communities seek. And so empowerment ends up being elsewhere. So as the presenters or as my fellow panelists mentioned, centering community actions, thinking about community organizing around meeting needs. I think we've all at some point touched upon the COVID-19 pandemic. In my previous research, domestic workers who were labeled as essential workers and needed to return to their workplace environments, which are essentially in the homes of others and threaten their own health and well-being and the health and well-being of their own communities. The women who were elderly, immunocompromised at the outset of the pandemic were supported by domestic workers unions who provided food, and provided supports for them to have access to the basics of life, similar to what it is that we've seen in Leonardo's presentation, where it is that centering community and recentering community allows for possibilities to expand. And so these kinds of alternatives, whether they are in the form of unions that are supporting neighborhoods and communities and seeing and meeting needs, or if it is the kind of historical resonance of quilombos and the kind of autonomous regions that support themselves, these are the alternatives that present themselves when it comes to these stressful times of instability. I would also say that in the aftermath of 2020, we have also seen an increase, but not fully representative, number of Black officials and leaders, both at the local, state, and national levels increase. Particularly, Black women have become a larger have taken up a larger presence in electoral and institutional politics. After the assassination of Marielle Franco, there has been a push to find political voice and space for the periphery, for the Black urban and rural core. And so we see this kind of way of even leveraging the systems of democracy to try to push for transformational change through it. But we have multiple fronts that we can observe to struggle against the constant oppression and repression of Black communities in Brazil. And so the Northeast in particular has this historical legacy of alienation, separation, and stigmatization that people are pushing back. The people themselves and the communities are pushing back against, while also trying to leverage the institutional processes as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. We have questions from the audience. We have the microphone. Let's start here. Okay, from the front, and then we'll go.
Questions?
Can you please mention your name and affiliation?
Sorry. I have 2 questions. My name is Trini Helen. I'm from the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque. The first question goes to Leonardo. And the question, you made mention of certain grassroots, in fact, you had a wonderful presentation. However, this is what I would like to know. How do these grassroots strategies influence the political decision in Peru? And how have corruption affected governance and public trust in Peruvian politics? My second question is addressed to Dr. Jaira. Yeah, my second question. Thank you. How have structural racism affected access to education and health in the Black communities? Thank you.
Okay, let's take a few questions and then you can.
Franco Barchiesi from The Ohio State University. I have a question for the 3 presenters. Sounds like to me that your great informative presentations are all revolving around contexts of liminality, or the condition of being within certain boundaries, but not quite. And in the case of the first 2 presentations, the boundaries in question are bounding the concept of property. And one is liminal in relation to property itself. And it is quite clear that the notion of land titles plays a very significant political and imaginative role in those 2 cases. Land titles in the sense that either you have them or you don't have them, you are claiming them, or you think you might have them, while being able to grow stuff in the absence of them. And both presentations at the same time emphasize the practices that you are discussing as challenging or departing from the logic of capitalism. And I wanted to actually ask you, under what, how do you conceptualize an imagination of land titles as departing or criticizing a concept of capitalism? Is it mostly because those titles are imagined and elaborated at a collective level rather than in individual form, or is there some meaning to the claim itself, to the notion itself that questions a capitalist logic? And to Dr. Harrington, the concept in relation to which that liminality is played out is democracy itself, of course. We're talking about Black communities that are within a democratic space that calls itself democratic, but not quite. And I was quite struck by the last quote by the activist from São Luís de Maranhão, basically saying, okay, yeah, they tell us that we are in a democracy, but what we know is that in order to be in a democracy, we need a bunch of stuff that right now is reserved to white people. And forgive the facile syllogism, therefore democracy is stuff for white people. I mean, what they call democracy here is something that has never been really thought of or imagined with Black self-determination in mind. And that is a line of critique that democracy is something imagined for white people to inherit as citizens and actors that has been quite central to a range of Black critiques from Brazil of especially the by now quite trite notion of racial democracy. Here I'm thinking of the work of Denise Ferreira da Silva or Jaime Amparo Alves or João Costa Vargas. And yes, I mean, I guess that the question is what would you say to the thought that it is the way that democracy is conceived essentially in Brazil that is fundamentally anti-Black?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lalita Kamath, and I'm a Fulbright Fellow here at Penn. And I teach at the University in Mumbai, India. Thank you to all three of you for really very good presentations, very thought-provoking. So actually, I had a question for each one of you. For you, Anderson, I'm curious about this, again, the council. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how conflict plays out within the council. And therefore, I've been thinking more recently about the concept, sort of a more agonistic approach, and so the role of sort of associated with conflict, the idea of how conflict can work in the political sphere. And so I'm really curious, and particularly it was in relation, I think, to the question so beautifully articulated by the previous person. So I think particularly in relation to sort of land titles, the ideas of property, which are so much focused on the individual. And so I think I would be curious if you can talk about conflict and how that plays out. For you, Leonardo, I really liked, and I'm very interested in the idea of crisis that you have been focused on so much and so central to your presentation. So much when talking about climate change and a whole series of polycrises today, the whole focus is very much on a certain notion of crisis in terms of crisis governance and the response to that. And that's a very different understanding of crisis. And so I think I'd be very curious if you could talk a little bit about the kind of everyday crisis that you are describing in your work. What kind of crisis is that? Is that any, is that so in some ways you talked about living through crisis, but I'm sort of pushing you to talk a little bit more about living in crisis and what that everyday crisis looks like to these people. And for you, Jaira, I'm again a little bit connected to, I think, the question of the previous speaker, but really what came out strongly to me, and your presentation was so nicely framed and very clear, but it left me thinking, like, in some ways, the question you pose is a very old question, because democracy has always not worked for many groups of people in very unequal societies. And so really, it's really about what is new, or is there anything new about this particular moment in Brazil that you're talking about for these Black communities? So if you could talk about, and I think you very much signal that talking about a post-Bolsonaro moment, but I think I'd be curious about thinking about the long histories of the failures of democracy. How do we then maybe reimagine this democratic project itself? And is it then really one about Black and white, or is it something beyond that? I mean, other countries could potentially learn from as well.
If we have only one more question, I think we should just take it now so the speakers can just respond to all the questions at one time.
Good morning. I'm Giovanni Roche. I'm a PhD candidate here in Africana Studies and Political Science. Thank you so much for the presentations. Dr. Harrington, it's great to see you again. I have a question that touches a little bit on the idea of institutional politics that Dr. Harrington mentioned at the end. The past 40 years have also been marked by the development of several government institutions like the Ministry of Racial Equality, that's now Ministry of Racial Equality, but before it was the Secretariat for Racial Equality Promotion. Bahia also has a similar organization, which is CIPRONI, right?
Yes.
And that's something that we have seen in many different parts of Brazil, and many of them are actually specific for Quilombola communities as well. And another interesting feature of these institutions is the fact that they are usually structured and they are composed of people who were actually members of the Black movements, members of these communities, right? So I guess my question is, how do you see this new chapter of institutional politics playing out in the conditions of these communities, right? So for example, if we think about the Quilombola communities, does it make a difference if they have a specific person in the government of Bahia who's taking care, quote unquote, of the rights of the Quilombola communities in the state? Or is that some sort of like a window dressing sort of institution that doesn't really function in a way that benefits these communities? And I guess the same question for Dr. Harrington, right? Does it make a difference to have institutions like this? Thank you.
Thank you. So should we start in reverse? Jared, do you want to start?
Sure, I will start. I really do appreciate these questions. So kind of like in sum, is there anything new? There are some cyclical patterns that we can also observe that many of the aforementioned ministries were initiated under the previous regime of the Lula da Silva administration, only to be threatened, destroyed, and needing to be rebuilt after the Bolsonaro regime. And so this kind of question of democracy and its fundamental anti-Blackness, I would agree. And I think that, again, like the historical cycles of theorists, including Abdias Nascimento, Lelia Gonzalez, Sueli Carneiro, Ferreira, like we've seen this conversation happen before. And so I would fundamentally agree that these kinds of patterns that we're observing, that we're seeing aren't exactly new, also give us insights into what are open possibilities. So democracy and political science, and I'd like to also speak to that kind of as the standard of political organization, is a maybe also something that needs to be interrogated. We have the research, the responses, and centering those who are most marginalized in the research that I'm presenting, but there are other scholars who have done similar kinds of studies. And in looking at the kind of outcomes that continue to happen, continued economic oppression, continued, as was asked before, structural racism and access to education, where there are reforms like the law 10639 of 2003 that ensures that Afro-Brazilian history and culture is taught. But this kind of access to Afro-centered knowledges, is it done in a way that honors Black people in the present? Is it done in institutions or schools that are well-resourced with faculty and instructors that are concerned about the ability of students to move forward? Are they given the tools to be able to do that? And so this is where we get back to this democracy of appearances. This is where we kind of return to the beginning, where the kind of actions that take place within institutions that are fundamentally anti-Black, that are fundamentally concerned about profit margins and the ability to develop areas that have lovely beaches, like in the state of Bahia or in Maranhão, where the focus is not on the kind of well-being of the people, where the kind of health and the threats to communities through environmental racism and the kind of exploratory projects, these are all connected. And so I guess fundamentally, without being too heavy-handed with it, I am centering the conversations and the discourses of Black Brazilian people in these areas that are among the most marginal in the research, and also the most marginal in the reach of what are mechanisms of democratic inclusion that are coming to these conclusions themselves, that these kinds of institutions are offering opportunities for reform that are liberal in nature, but not transforming ultimately the lives of the people who are living in these conditions. So I'm not going to say it, but the interviews that I have, people are saying, well, we've been organizing at the grassroots level. We have been making a way to support one another. We have been, finding ways to navigate through what are these ongoing patterns of instability. So that's what I'll say about it.
We have, about 6 minutes left, so 3 minutes each for your responses.
Who's going to start?
You. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
We'll start with the last question. Yes, about how is the crisis itself. Well, around 70% of the Peruvians, their income depends on these micro and small companies, and those are the ones who are having these extortions. Even these extortions with these criminals, they are colluded mostly with the police. There is a lot of proofs and documented cases where the police weapons are being borrowed by these criminals. When we had this emblematic case where a grenade from the Peruvian army was used in Ecuador's crime, and it was recovered, this grenade itself. So there is a lot of documentation over there. And because of this insecurity, because of these harassments against the local population, and they cannot properly earn the money they need, and this is impacting the food insecurity. Like 57%, according to reporting October last year, 57% of the Peruvians say their household ran out of food in the last 3 months. This is the worst scenario in South American countries. And so we also have a systemic normalization of abuse of indigenous communities. There is, like, for example, 500 school students from One-Piece and Navajo communities, those are rainforest communities in the Amazon communities, who were raped by their own teachers in their schools. And the education ministry here, it says it's only cultural practices. So this is a normalization of those type of abusements. This is also related to corruption. It's a systemic corruption. You only have 2 minutes, This is systemic corruption since the 90s that you can see it if you check our past presidents, if they are not in prison, they are that. Even one of them committed suicide because he was being captured at that moment when he committed suicide to avoid prison. We about grassroots, how it works. As we said, the resilience is there trying to solve these type of problems, but it's difficult without a proper funding from the local governments. Yeah, I ran out of 20 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, we're here for 2 days, so these conversations can actually continue. Yes, please.
Sure. I'm going to try to answer from the last question to the first one. If it makes a difference having these new ministries being created. Because my approach is a history from below, I have not interviewed public officials, and I have not included them in my semi-structured interviews, but I did review the literature. Currently, these communities complete 20 years that they have been titled, that they have been recognized as Maroon communities. And 20 years now, they have not been granted an official entitling. So it does make a difference, but to the main goal that these people are pursuing, it doesn't make a difference, or at least it doesn't answer to the extent that they expect. Conflict. There is a lot of conflict. During my fieldwork, there was a lot of conflict. It was really interesting to navigate those conflicts regarding my presence as an outsider, even though I come from a neighboring Black rural community. The time it took to build trust was interesting to see how those folks that initially would tell me that, no, there is no problem going on here. There's nothing, we live here peacefully. There's nothing going on. And then later on, as we build trust, people would then tell me what was going on. I knew beforehand, but would not tell, oh, I know that you're not telling me. I would rather like notice how these would evolve during the research process. It was really interesting. For example, there is a farmer that asks people to pay a monthly fee. Nobody told me about this at the beginning of the research. There's no problem here regarding land. And then 4 months later, somebody told me, oh, you know what? There is this person in that location that asks people to pay a monthly fee. Otherwise, she threatens to destroy their crops and so forth. So conflict, there is a lot. Conflicts in the meeting, conflicts, internal conflicts, and conflicts with outsiders. In the research, I committed, I think I can tell this because it's not a problem. I committed when I presented my proposal that I would not explore internal conflicts for the sake of publishing. So I am not interested in exposing the internal conflicts of the communities. And that was an agreement that we had when we approved the proposal. So I'm interested in how labor, environment, and pollution affect them, but I'm not going to explore internal conflicts. First question on the linearity and how people see property. It's clear for some of the council members that the sort of violence that they experience, the exposure to waste, the exposure to toxic material, the threats to the social reproduction is linked to capitalism, of course, and land titling won't solve those issues because some communities in Maranhão, for example, that already have their land titles still face a lot of violence. So they have a clear understanding that they have to continue to resist together in the territory, standing by themselves, and not expecting, for example, that the state with a land title will solve all the problems. It is important because at least it prevents some forms of violence, but it's not the end goal. In terms of practices, whenever they stand for the communities, they don't stand for a single community, at least the council members. They stand always for all the communities across the basin. If there is a problem on the table to be discussed, it's always discussed on the impact, on the basis of the sort of impacts it will bring to the whole communities, not only a single one, not only a specific individual or a specific leader. And they do refuse the individualistic practices within the council and in the interactions in organizations and researchers. I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you very much to the panelists. Please, can you give the panelists a round of applause again? And thank you, the audience. So we'll have a 15-minute break and before the next panel. Thank you again.